I have known Edmund Ashcroft, Duke of Morecombe, since we were boys of 9 years old when he pushed me into a fish pond at his father's estate and then, without a word of apology, pulled me out again. That was the whole of Edmund in miniature, the damage first, the rescue second, and never an explanation offered in between. We were friends from that moment. I cannot say why. Perhaps because I understood, even at 9, that the pushing had not been cruelty, it had been a test, and that the hand reaching down to pull me out had been, in its way, a declaration of loyalty that would hold for the next 40 years. I am telling you this because what happened at Morecombe Hall in the autumn of 1814 is a story that requires a witness, and I am the only one fit to give it. Edmund would not tell it himself. He is constitutionally incapable of narrating his own heart, and Cecily Vane, as she was then before she became the Duchess of Morecombe, would tell it from her own side, which is true but incomplete. She did not see the 8 years. I did. I am Callum Prest. I hold no title, only a modest estate in Somerset and the distinction of being the one man in England Edmund Ashcroft trusts entirely. I have watched him manage 3,000 acres, 2 difficult parliamentary votes, and the grief of losing both parents before he was 25, all with the same composure he showed at 9 years old, damage absorbed, hand extended, nothing explained. What I had never seen him do, in all of that, was want something he could not administer. Until the summer of 1806, at a country house party in Wiltshire, when he saw Cecily Vane for the first time. She was 22 that summer. Not a beauty in the way the season catalogued beauties, no particular fortune, no influential family, no celebrated complexion that the gossips would circle and praise. Her father had been a rector in Devonshire, dead 3 years by then, and she lived with her uncle in a modest parsonage near Exeter, managing the household accounts with the same clear-eyed efficiency with which she seemed to manage everything else. She had come to the party at Aldfield House as the guest of her cousin, Miss Harriet Vane, whose mother had married up and was eager to display the connection. Cecily was, in that context, the poor relation, invited because Harriet loved her, tolerated because she was quiet and undemanding, and largely overlooked by the sort of people who assessed a woman's worth by her father's annual income. I noticed her on the first evening because she corrected Lord Aldfield's steward on a matter of crop rotation. Not loudly, not with any performance of cleverness, but with the calm precision of someone who had simply read more carefully than the steward had, and then returned to her soup without looking around to see whether anyone had observed it. Edmund was sitting 2 seats away. He had observed it. He said nothing that evening. He said nothing the following morning or the afternoon or the dinner that followed. He watched, in the particular way Edmund watched things he found interesting, not staring, nothing so obvious, but with a quality of sustained attention that I had learned to recognize over 30 years of friendship. He watched the way she moved through a room, not with the studied grace of a woman performing for an audience, but with the unself-conscious competence of someone who had places to be and was simply going to them. He watched the way she spoke to the servants directly, without condescension, with a brief and genuine warmth that they returned in kind. He watched the way she handled the 2 hours each afternoon when the other ladies rested, and she sat in the garden with a book, reading with the same settled attention she gave to everything else. On the 4th day he approached her. I was close enough to hear. It was not a long conversation. He asked about the book. It was a volume on agricultural improvement, which was not a fashionable choice, but Cecily had stopped pretending to care about fashion some years before. She answered him directly, without the performance of modest surprise that most young women employed when a duke spoke to them. They talked for perhaps 20 minutes about drainage and soil and the particular stubbornness of Devonshire clay. At the end of it Edmund bowed. She returned it. He walked away. That evening he found me in the billiard room and said, without preamble, that he wanted to have her portrait painted. I set down my cue. I beg your pardon. "There is a painter here," he said. "Fellows. He has done good work. I want him to paint Miss Vane." "You have spoken to her once," I said, "for 20 minutes about drainage." "I am aware of how long I spoke to her." "Edmund." "Quietly," he said. "I don't want a production of it. I'll speak to Fellows. She need only sit a few times." I looked at him for a long moment. In 30 years of friendship, I had seen Edmund Ashcroft want many things: land, order, competence, privacy, the particular satisfaction of a well-managed estate. I had never seen him want a woman's face. "Does she know?" I said. "Not yet." He picked up a cue and examined the tip. "I'll ask her permission. I'll make it seem a general thing. Fellows is painting several of the guests." "Is he?" "He will be." I should have pressed him further. I should have asked what exactly he intended to do with a portrait of a woman he had spoken to once about Devonshire clay, whether he meant to court her, what his plan was, whether he had considered that Cecily Vane was the sort of woman who would see straight through a half-truth if he offered her one. But Edmund had that quality of absolute composure that made further questions feel superfluous, as though the matter were already settled in some interior room he had not invited me into. He spoke to Fellows that night. He arranged for 3 other guests to sit as well, so it would seem a general whim of the party. He approached Cecily the following morning and asked, politely, without ceremony, whether she would object to Fellows including her among the sitters. She looked at him for a moment with those clear gray eyes of hers, the ones that always seemed to be measuring something, and said she had no objection at all. She sat 4 times over the following week. Fellows worked in the small morning room off the east corridor, and Edmund did not once appear while she was sitting. I will give him that, though I noticed he managed to be in the corridor outside on 2 of those afternoons, attending to correspondence that could easily have been attended to elsewhere. The portrait was finished on the last day of the party. It was very good. Fellows had caught something true about her, the quality of held attention that lived in her face, the way her mouth was almost amused without quite committing to it, the steadiness in the gray eyes. Edmund paid Fellows handsomely, thanked him, and sent him on his way. Then he took the portrait home to Morecambe Hall and put it in his private library, where no one but he ever went. And said nothing. Not that summer, not the following spring, not in the 3 London seasons that followed, during all of which Cecily Vane appeared occasionally on the edges of society, not a regular fixture. She had neither the money nor the inclination for the full run of it. And Edmund appeared also, with the regularity of a man who had business in London and the composure of a man who was attending entirely to that business. But I watched him. I had been watching him for 30 years, and I knew the particular way he managed a room when she was in it, the slight recalibration of his position, the attention that seemed general but was not, the care he took to place himself where he could observe her without appearing to. I watched him watch her speak to Lord Carnforth at the Alderton ball, and then announce, the following week, that Lord Carnforth was not a man to be trusted in matters of investment or character. I watched him arrive at the Devereux Musicale 12 minutes after Cecily did, and position himself 3 rows back on the right, which was where I knew she preferred to sit when she wanted to hear well. I watched him once at Lady Pemberton's evening party begin to cross a room toward her, and then stop and turn, and spend the rest of the evening near the window. He never spoke to her again, not in 8 years. Not a word beyond the formal acknowledgment of passing acquaintance when circumstance made it unavoidable. I asked him once, this was in the 3rd year after the musicale, what precisely he was doing. He was quiet for a long moment, then he said, "She is content." "I beg your pardon." "Cecily Vane is content. She has her uncle's household and her books and her own management of things. She has a life she has built to suit herself. She is not unhappy." "Edmund." "And I," he said, with a flatness that was not resignation but something harder and more decided, "am not a man who makes women happy." I opened my mouth, he looked at me, I closed it again. That was the end of the conversation. He had good reasons for believing that, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Edmund Ashcroft had been 17 years old when his mother died, 20 when his father followed, 22 when he came fully into the dukedom, and found that the estate had been managed with what might generously be called cheerful indifference, and what was more accurately described as ruinous carelessness. He had spent the better part of 5 years putting it right, the farms, the tenancies, the drainage that kept failing along the eastern boundary, the dependent households that had been quietly falling apart. He was good at it. He was very good at it. He had the temperament for the long-sustained application of intelligence to an intractable problem, and Morecambe under his management became, by the time he was 30, one of the most orderly and productive estates in Cornwall. But orderly management requires a kind of containment, the suppression of impulse, the preference for the deliberate over the spontaneous, the willingness to be thought cold rather than admit uncertainty. And Edmund had practiced that containment for so long that I was genuinely unsure, in the 3rd and 4th year of his silence, whether he was protecting Cecily from disruption, or protecting himself from a risk he could not calculate. Probably both. Edmund's rationalizations were always half true, which made them harder to argue with. In the 4th year, Cecily's uncle died and she went to live for a time with Harriet, who had by then married a Mr. Forsyth in Gloucestershire, and had a house and 3 children, and warmly welcomed any company. In the 5th year she returned to Devonshire, to a small cottage of her own that she had apparently been planning for some time, had saved for, had furnished herself, had arranged with the same quiet competence she applied to everything. I heard about it through Harriet and mentioned it to Edmund. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Good, that is good." "Is it?" I said. "She is independent now, on her own terms." "Edmund," I said, "she is 30 years old. She is living alone in a cottage in Devonshire because no one has offered her anything better. She has not been offered anything she wished to accept." This was true. There had been 2 offers as far as I could discover, a clergyman in the 4th year and a widowed solicitor in the 5th. Both refused. Edmund knew this. I did not ask how. "Wanting better is not the same as having it," I said. He looked out the window of his study at the sea. Morecambe's library looked south over the cliff edge, and on a clear day you could see France, or thought you could, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Callum, what exactly do you propose I do?" "I propose you speak to her," I said. "I propose you go to Devonshire and speak to the woman whose portrait has been hanging in your private library for 5 years, and tell her something that resembles the truth." He turned and looked at me with that dark, settled gaze of his, the one that had frightened 3 stewards and 2 members of Parliament into compliance, and which had absolutely no effect on me whatsoever, and said, "She would think me a lunatic." "She might," I said, "or she might not." He said nothing. He turned back to the window. He did not go to Devonshire. In the 8th year, Harriet Forsyth wrote to Edmund. I did not know she had done this until afterward. She had never been a shy woman, Harriet. All the boldness that Cecily redirected into practicality sat openly in Harriet, and she had decided, apparently, that 8 years was enough to watch 2 people of good sense and quiet feeling fail to arrive at the obvious conclusion. She wrote to Edmund. I have seen the letter since. She gave it to me to read after, with the particular satisfied smile of a woman who has been right about something for a very long time, to inform him that she and her family would be spending a fortnight at Morecambe Hall in the 2nd week of October, and that she intended to bring Cecily. She did not ask, she informed. Edmund showed me the letter on a Tuesday morning. He was holding it with a quality of careful stillness that I recognized, after 30 years, as something close to alarm. "You could write back and decline," I said. "I can't decline Harriet," he said. He was right. No one could decline Harriet. "Then you'd better have the East Wing aired," I said. It's October. Cornwall in October wants a warm bedroom. He set the letter down, picked it up, set it down again. I watched this with the entirely undeserved pleasure of a man who has waited 8 years for something to happen. "Callum," he said. "Yes." "The library." "Yes," I said, "the library." The portrait had been hanging there for 8 years, above the fireplace, in a room that no one but Edmund and, occasionally, myself ever entered. I had seen it dozens of times. Fellows had done very good work with the gray eyes. "I should take it down," he said. It was not quite a question. "You should do whatever seems right to you," I said, which was a perfectly useless answer, and we both knew it. He did not take it down. I am not certain whether this was courage or paralysis. With Edmund, the two had always looked remarkably alike from the outside. Harriet arrived on a Wednesday, preceded by 3 trunks, 2 children, 1 husband, and a quantity of cheerful noise that filled Morecambe Hall from the entrance hall to the upper landing, and sent the housekeeper into a state of suppressed agitation that lasted the better part of 2 days. Cecily came with her, stepping out of the carriage after Harriet, a little quieter, a little more contained, wearing a traveling dress in dark blue that suited her, and carrying her own bag without waiting for assistance. She was 30 now. She looked exactly like herself, which is to say, she looked exactly like the portrait, except that the portrait was 22 and had the particular clarity of a face that hasn't yet had time to become fully itself, and Cecily at 30 had arrived entirely into her own. The gray eyes were steadier. The almost amused quality around her mouth had deepened into something more considered. She was, in the plainest terms, more herself than she had been, and she had been quite herself already. Edmund was in the entrance hall to receive them. I stood slightly behind him, which is where I generally stood in situations that required a buffer. Harriet embraced him, she always did, despite every signal Edmund sent that he found this alarming, and introduced her children and made a great deal of warm noise. Edmund bore it with the composure of a man who has accepted that certain things in life will happen to him regardless of his preferences. Then Harriet stepped aside, and Cecily was there. "Miss Vane," Edmund said. His voice was entirely level. If you did not know him, you would have thought it indifference. If you had watched him for 8 years, you would have noticed that he was holding his hands clasped behind his back rather than at his sides, which was a thing he did only when he was making a particular effort at control. "Your Grace," Cecily said. Her curtsy was easy, unhurried. She looked at him with the clear gray eyes in the direct way she had, measuring, and then her gaze moved briefly, so briefly I almost missed it, to the space just behind him, as though taking inventory of the house she was entering. Then back. "I hope the journey was comfortable," he said. "Quite comfortable, thank you," she said. And that was that. They went into the house. I fell into step beside Harriet, who gave me a look of considerable meaning over her youngest child's head. "He hasn't taken the portrait down," I murmured. Harriet's smile was the smile of a woman holding very good cards. The fortnight began with the careful formality of 2 people who have not seen each other in years and have no established language between them. Edmund was a thorough host, Morecambe was run well, the food was excellent, the grounds were made available for Harriet's children to destroy at their leisure, but he arranged himself at a distance from Cecily with the same composed deliberateness with which he had arranged himself in London ballrooms. Present, attentive, not near. Cecily did not seem to require nearness. She moved through Morecambe with the same unself-conscious ease with which she moved through everything, admiring what was genuinely admirable, asking about what interested her, spending her afternoons in the library, not the private one, the main one, with the same settled absorption she had given to the agricultural improvement volume in Wiltshire 8 years before. I walked with her once along the clifftop path above the sea, and she talked about Devonshire and her cottage and the particular satisfaction of a household that answered to no one but its own logic, and I thought, she is genuinely content, not performing contentment, not settling for it. She had made a life she liked, and she was living inside it with her whole attention. It made what was coming both more complicated and, in a way I could not quite explain, more necessary. Edmund, meanwhile, was making himself useful at the far end of the estate. He appeared at dinner, conducted himself with perfect courtesy, and vanished after breakfast on the pretext of business. Harriet watched him across the table each evening with the patient expression of a woman prepared to intervene if necessary. On the 6th day it rained. Not a gentle Cornish mist, but a real October rain, the kind that drove sideways off the sea and reduced visibility to the length of the garden wall. Harriet's children were confined indoors and discovered new and creative methods of chaos. Harriet herself retreated to the sitting room with her mending and a quality of serene maternal composure. Mr. Forsyth read agricultural journals, which he had in common with Cecily, and they discussed them for a pleasant hour until he fell asleep. Edmund disappeared at 9 in the morning and did not reappear at the midday meal. By 2 o'clock the afternoon had settled into the particular gray stillness of a rain that intends to last all day. Harriet's children were sleeping. The house was quiet. I was in the main library reading when I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, light, certain footsteps, not Edmund's heavier, deliberate tread. I knew those footsteps. 8 years ago they had moved through the garden at Aldfield House with the same unhurried purpose. I heard them pause. I heard the sound of a door, not the main library door, which was to my right, but the door further down the corridor, the east door, the one that led to Edmund's private library, the door that was almost never left unlocked. Almost. I set down my book. For a moment everything was very quiet, just the rain against the windows and the distant management of Harriet's household somewhere above me. Then I heard her voice, clear and steady, say, "Oh." Just that, one syllable, the particular "oh" of a person who has walked into a room and found something that has entirely rearranged their understanding of a thing. I did not move. I am not entirely certain why. Perhaps because some part of me knew that what was happening in that room required a very particular kind of quiet, and that my presence would disturb it. Perhaps because I had been waiting 8 years for this exact moment, and I found, now that it was here, that I wanted to give it the space it deserved. I heard her footsteps cross the floor of the library. I heard them stop. I heard nothing else for perhaps 5 minutes. Then I heard a different set of footsteps in the corridor, heavier, deliberate, the particular measured tread of a man who has been managing himself for 30 years. And the sound of Edmund's voice saying my name once, questioningly, from the main library doorway. I looked up. He was standing in the doorway with his coat damp at the shoulders from the rain, having come in from the estate, and he was looking at me with an expression I had never quite seen on him before, a kind of held stillness that was not his usual composure but something adjacent to it, something thinner and less certain. I looked at the east door, which was standing open. He looked at it too. For a moment he did not move. I watched him understand what had happened, the unlocked door, the quiet afternoon, the absence of Cecily from the sitting room, and I watched what that understanding did to his face. It was not a dramatic thing. It was a very small, very private undoing, barely visible, the kind of thing you could only see if you had been watching someone for 30 years. Then he walked to the east door and went in. She was standing in front of the fireplace. I know this because I moved, after a moment, to the doorway of the main library, where I could see into the east library at an angle without being in it. I am not proud of this. I was 60% witness and 40% eavesdropper, and I have made my peace with the proportion. The portrait hung above the fireplace. It had always hung there. Fellows had delivered it in a plain frame, and Edmund had put it up the same day without ceremony, as though placing an important document in the correct file. He had added a better frame sometime in the second year, a gilt one, the kind that suited the room and the quality of the work. The fire had been laid that morning but not lit. It was a room that was kept tidy, aired, attended to, but not frequently inhabited. Except that there were fresh flowers on the desk, Michaelmas daisies in a plain green jug. Cecily had not noticed them yet, or had and was not currently attending to them because she was looking at the portrait. At herself, 8 years younger, gray-eyed, with the almost amused quality around the mouth, and the quality of held attention that fellows had caught and preserved in paint for 8 years, while the woman it depicted moved through a decade of her life not knowing it existed. Edmund came in and stopped just inside the doorway. She heard him. She turned. She looked at him with the gray eyes, the real ones, steadier and more considered than the painted ones, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then she said, "When was this done?" Her voice was entirely level, the Cecily Vane way, not cold, not accusing, simply asking for accurate information. "The summer of 1806, he said, "at Aldfield House." She was quiet for a moment, working something out. I watched her count the years. 8 years ago, she said. "Yes." She looked back at the portrait, then at him. "Why?" she said, not angrily, not with distress. In the particular way she asked questions as though she genuinely wanted to understand and had no interest in being managed with anything other than the truth. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Long enough that I thought, not for the first time, and not without a certain exasperated affection, that he was going to say something careful and insufficient, and let the moment close around them like a door. He had done it in ballrooms for 8 years. He was entirely capable of doing it here, in his own private library, with her portrait above the fireplace and nowhere left to retreat to. But he did not. He said, "Because I could not ask you to sit again." She looked at him. "Because if I had asked you to sit again," he said, "I would have had to explain why I wanted another portrait. And if I had explained why I wanted another portrait, I would have had to say something true. And he stopped, looked at the portrait, not at her for just a moment, then back. "I was not certain you would want to hear it." "You were not certain," she said, "for 8 years. "Yes," he said. A long pause, the rain on the windows. "That is a very long time to be uncertain," she said. "It is," he said. "I am aware of that." She looked at him with a quality I can only describe as careful. Not soft. Cecily was never soft in the sentimental sense, but careful. The way she looked at the drainage report at Aldfield, measuring the information against what she knew, working out whether it could be trusted. "You are not an uncertain man," she said. "You are the least uncertain man of my acquaintance. You have an opinion on crop rotation and parliamentary reform, and the proper management of Cornish drainage, and approximately everything else I have ever heard you speak about." "That is true," he said. "So this," she said, with a gesture toward the portrait that took in the 8 years and the gilt frame and the fresh flowers in the green jug, was not uncertainty. He was quiet for a moment, then very quietly he said, "No." "Then what was it?" And there it was, the question he had not been asked and had not asked himself, not in any honest form, for 8 years. I watched him stand in the middle of his private library in his damp coat and face it. He said, "It was the belief that a woman who had built a life on her own terms had no particular need to have it disrupted by a man whose primary qualities are silence and the management of 3,000 Cornish acres." The silence after that was considerable. Cecily looked at him for a long time. I could not read what was in her face with the certainty I might have wished. It was her face, not a text on soil composition, and she had always held more than she showed. But there was something there. Something that was not the coolness of the polite stranger or the warmth of the comfortable acquaintance, but something older and less categorized than either. The way you sometimes look at a landscape you have seen in a painting for years and find, arriving at it, that it is both entirely as you expected and also somehow larger. She said, and if the woman in question found the disruption less objectionable than anticipated. Edmund looked at her, very still, the kind of still he got when something important was being decided. Then I would be grateful to know it, he said, and I would ask, he stopped, began again. I would very much like to ask whether you would be willing to walk with me, tomorrow if the rain has passed, along the cliff path. I would like to talk to you. More than 20 minutes, about things other than drainage. A beat. You remember the drainage conversation, she said. I remember every conversation, he said. I have had very few of them with you. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile, not yet, but the approach of one, the territory just before it. The almost amused quality that fellows had seen at 22, older now and more settled, and altogether more real. That is, she said after a moment, a somewhat extraordinary thing to say. I am aware, he said. You have been watching me in ballrooms for 8 years. Not every ballroom. Several ballrooms. Yes, he said, several ballrooms. She looked at the portrait again, then at him. Then with the directness that was entirely, essentially her, the flowers on the desk. He followed her gaze to the Michaelmas daisies in the green jug. A pause. The housekeeper, he began. No, she said. I have been a housekeeper's daughter for 30 years. That jug has been placed there this morning by someone who knew the room would be used today. Someone who wanted it to be, she looked for the word, welcoming. He said nothing. Edmund, she said. It was the first time she had used his name. I watched it land on him. Yes, he said. I asked Mrs. Tanner to put flowers in here this morning. I was not certain you would come in. The door was. I may not have locked it with the care I usually. You left it unlocked. Yes. On a rainy afternoon when the rest of the house was occupied, and I was known to have a habit of reading in libraries. A long pause. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a moment with those clear, steady eyes. Then she said, I think that is the least uncertain thing I have ever heard. And there it was, the smile, fully arrived, the one that the portrait had always only approached. It was a very contained smile, distinctly her own, nothing theatrical about it, but it changed the whole room. Edmund, who had managed 3,000 acres and 2 parliamentary votes and 8 years of silence with perfect composure, looked, for just a moment, entirely at a loss. Will you walk with me tomorrow? He said. If the rain has passed, she said. And if it hasn't? She considered. Then we will walk anyway, she said. I am not afraid of Cornish rain. He looked at her for a moment with an expression I had never once seen on his face in 40 years of friendship. It was not triumph. It was not relief, exactly. It was something quieter than either of those things. The specific expression of a man who has carried something very carefully for a very long time and has just been told he may set it down. Miss Vane, he said, Cecily, her name in his voice for the first time, I owe you 8 years of conversation. You do, she said. I suggest you begin paying the debt promptly. The rain passed by morning. They walked for 3 hours along the cliff path above the sea, Edmund and Cecily, side by side, in the clear October light with the Atlantic below them and the gorse burning yellow on the headland. I know this because I watched them go and I watched them return, and because the 3 hours were not a short walk to the first headland and back, but the long circuit, the one that goes out to the point above Porthaven Cove and down through the village and back along the inland path, the walk you take with someone when you have something worth the distance to say. I did not walk with them. This was, for once, not my story to witness. Harriet found me in the main library at 11 o'clock and sat down across from me with a cup of tea and the expression of a woman receiving a long-awaited intelligence report. Well, she said. They are on the long walk, I said. She pressed her lips together in the particular way of a woman suppressing visible satisfaction. How long? Since 9, the long circuit, 3 hours, perhaps 4. And last evening? They spoke after dinner for 20 minutes in the corridor outside the drawing room, while you and Forsyth were attending to young William's encounter with the coal scuttle. I heard William. I did not miss much. She set down her tea. Callum. Is he going to manage this? I thought about Edmund standing in the private library in his damp coat, saying 8 years of silence in 2 sentences about a woman who had built a life on her own terms. I thought about Cecily's contained, entirely genuine smile. Yes, I said, I believe he is going to manage it very well. Harriet looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, Good, because she has been managing on her own for a very long time, and she deserves to be managed for a change. They came back at 12:30, salt-aired and unhurried, and the particular quality of the silence between them had changed. Not filled. Edmund and Cecily were never going to be people who felt the need to fill silence, but different. The silence of 2 people who have found a shared language, and are now comfortable inside it rather than kept apart by it. At luncheon, Edmund sat beside her, which he had not done since the first evening. They talked, not a great deal, but steadily, with the quality of a conversation that is continuing rather than beginning. He asked her something about the cottage in Devonshire, and she answered at length, and I watched him listen with the full and undivided attention of a man who has been waiting 8 years to hear the details and is not about to miss any of them. In the afternoon, they sat in the main library together. Not side by side, there was still between them the careful distance of 2 people who have been their own separate persons for a long time and are learning the geography of proximity. But in the same room, with the same quality of mutual easiness that I had once seen Cecily achieve with a book, and that I had not, until now, seen her achieve with a person. On the 3rd evening after the library, the 9th of the fortnight, Edmund found me in the billiard room after dinner. He was holding a glass of port with the deliberateness of a man who has something to say and is choosing his moment. I am going to ask her, he said. I set down my cue. When? Tomorrow. There is a place on the headland. I want to show her the view from the south point. It's best in the morning, before the haze comes up. Edmund, I said, she already said yes. He looked at me. She has not said yes to anything. She smiled, I said. Cecily Vane does not produce that smile for things she intends to refuse. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with a care that was entirely characteristic of him, I do not want to assume. No, I said, of course not. You have spent 8 years not assuming. One more morning will not hurt you. The ghost of something, not quite a smile, but the approaching territory, crossed his face. It was the same expression, I realized, that he had been looking at in a portrait for 8 years. The apple, as someone wiser than me had no doubt observed, does not fall far. Callum, he said. Yes. Thank you. For not, he stopped. For the past 8 years, for not. I pushed you into the pond, I said. It seemed only fair to wait while you climbed out. He looked at me for a moment. Then he set down his port, picked up a cue, and said, Your break, I believe. I did not go to the South Headland the following morning. This was not the story I had earned the right to witness, or if it was, I had used that right in the library doorway, and what remained belonged entirely to them. Harriet told me afterward that they were gone for 2 hours, and that when they came back Cecily was wearing Edmund's coat. It had turned cold on the headland, and that Harriet, watching from the upper landing window, had observed the particular way Cecily moved inside that coat, which was not the way a woman moves in a borrowed garment, but the way she moves in something she has already decided is hers. The engagement was not announced until the family had been informed. Edmund wrote to Cecily's cousin that evening, and to several others over the following days. But it was known. in the particular way that such things are known in a small household. From that afternoon, Mrs. Tanner put fresh flowers in the private library. Harriet's children, briefed by their mother, were on their best behavior at dinner, which lasted approximately 40 minutes before the youngest discovered that the fruit bowl was within arm's reach. Edmund, at the foot of the table, watched Cecily manage the youngest Forsythe's relationship with a pair with the same quality of attention he had directed at her for 8 years in ballrooms, except that now it was open, unguarded, not arranged to seem otherwise. She caught him watching and looked back without looking away. I have known Edmund Ashcroft for 40 years, and in all of that time I do not believe I have seen him caught in anything, not in anything that mattered. He did not look away either. They were married in the church at Morecambe Village in the first week of the following March, on a morning that could not quite decide between winter and spring, and settled for both thin pale sun and a cold wind off the sea, primroses in the hedgerows, the water gray and bright by turns. Cecily wore a gown of ivory wool that she had made sensible and elegant with the same economy she brought to everything, and no veil, because she had never been the sort of woman who required things between herself and the world. Edmund was already in the church when she arrived. This is not the custom. The groom waits for the bride to walk to him. But Edmund, as I have noted, had been waiting in one form or another for 8 years, and had apparently decided that a church was a reasonable place to wait for 10 minutes more. I was standing at the back when she came in, her hand on Mr. Forsythe's arm, Harriet behind her with an expression of radiant vindication that she was not even attempting to conceal, and I watched her walk up the aisle in the thin March light and saw the moment Edmund turned and saw her. He had looked at her portrait for 8 years. He was not, I think, looking at the portrait now. The ceremony was brief and plain, the way Cecily preferred things. They spoke their vows in the clear, particular voices of people who had considered what the words meant before agreeing to say them, and when the ring was placed, a Morecambe family ring, old gold with a dark garnet, chosen by Edmund and approved by Cecily with the directness that was entirely her. She looked down at it for a moment, and then back up with an expression that was not the performed emotion of the occasion, but the real, private thing, quiet and full and entirely her own. After the ceremony, in the churchyard in the pale March sun, I stood beside Harriet and watched them talk to the Morecambe tenants. Several families who had come to see their Duke married and were now discovering, with visible pleasure, that the woman he had married looked them directly in the eye and asked their names and listened to the answers. Cecily Vane, who had spent 8 years managing a rector's household, and then a small Devon cottage, moving through the world on her own sufficiency, was standing in a churchyard in Cornwall being greeted as the Duchess of Morecambe with the same ease with which she had done everything else, not performing, not overwhelmed, simply being thoroughly herself in a new context. Edmund, beside her, had the air of a man who has spent 40 years holding a great estate in meticulous order, and has just discovered that the one thing he could not manage into place had arrived and arranged itself. Harriet found me on the path back to the house. She tucked her hand into my arm with the comfortable familiarity of someone who has been my co-conspirator for the better part of a year. 8 years, she said. 8 years, I agreed. If she had walked into that library on the first day. She would not have been ready on the first day, I said, and neither would he. Harriet considered this. Do you think it would have taken less time if you had pushed him harder? I thought of Edmund at 9 years old, pushing me into the fish pond and reaching down to pull me out again. I thought of him in the billiard room at Aldfield, saying he wanted a portrait with the flatness of a man who has already made a decision and is simply informing the world of it. I thought of him in his private library in his damp coat, saying 8 years of unspoken truth in 2 careful sentences to a woman who was asking him, with all her directness, to say the actual thing. No, I said, the time was the time. Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then, looking ahead to where Edmund and Cecily were walking together up the path side by side, not quite touching, and then touching, her hand finding his arm in the natural way of people who have finally closed the distance, she said, "She is going to make him very happy." "She is going to make him think harder," I said, "about drainage among other things." Harriet laughed. It was a warm and entirely satisfied laugh, the laugh of a woman who has been right about something for a very long time and does not intend to be modest about it. The portrait still hangs in the private library at Morecombe Hall. Cecily found it there on her first evening as Duchess and stood in front of it for a moment, herself, 22, the gray eyes clear, the almost amused quality around the mouth preserved in paint, and then turned to Edmund, who was standing in the doorway watching her with his hands clasped behind his back. "You could move it," she said. "Yes," he said. "Where would you like it?" She looked at it for a moment more. "Here," she said. "I think here is right. It has been here for 8 years. It knows the room." She walked past him into the corridor, touching his arm briefly as she went, the particular touch of a woman who has decided something and is satisfied with the decision. Edmund stood for a moment in the doorway of his private library, looking at the portrait of his wife above the fireplace, the girl she had been, 22 and clear-eyed and on the edge of her own life, and then he turned and followed her into the house. I know this because I was at the end of the corridor, where I had absolutely no business being, and watched the whole of it. Some habits after 40 years are not worth breaking. And some things, the right things, the true things, the things a man carries in a locked room for 8 years until the woman they belong to walks in and finds them, are worth every year of the waiting.